Today's lesson is on stress appraisal. Stress appraisal is the process of interpreting and appraising a particular stressor that we're facing. As a stressor is encountered, the significance and potential consequences of that stressor is assessed. There was a study done by Rossen and colleagues in 2020 that outlined stress appraisal as a two-step process where firstly we assess if a stressor is even relevant to our goals and aspirations. And if it is, we do a second assessment on whether or not that stressor will facilitate or impede the progress toward our desired outcome. In other words, do we have the confidence that we can adequately cope with that stressor? Do we have the skills? Do we have the organizational support? Do we have the resources and time and energy to overcome that obstacle? And if so, then we perceive it as a challenge. But if not, if we feel overwhelmed or incapable of dealing with that stressor, then we identify it as a hindrance. So the very same stressor, depending on the situation, can be perceived differently based on various factors, such as how the stressor relates to a person's goals, their previous experience with similar situations, and of course, their available resources. On this slide, we're going to further distinguish between challenge and hindrance stress. So if a stressor is perceived as a challenge, then we typically view it as an opportunity for growth or advancement toward our goals. Additionally, we have the confidence in our ability or skills to overcome that obstacle, and we also believe that we have the needed resources, including time and energy, to face that obstacle. So as such, challenges, or stressors that we view as challenges, foster feelings of motivation, determination, and attentiveness within our behavior and efforts toward working on that task. On the other hand, if we perceive a stressor as a hindrance, then we're having feelings of threat toward our goals or obstacles that we can't overcome. We're going to have a diminished sense of well-being, and we're also going to feel as though our resources are being depleted as we face that particular type of stressor. When we feel overwhelmed or we have the lack of confidence in accomplishing a task, then we are going to very likely experience feelings of anxiety or helplessness, or we're going to have emotions of evasion or task avoidance. So these differing appraisals can stem from differences in perspectives that we might have, and this can be created from the goal orientation that we currently have. It can relate to our mindset. Additionally, it can be influenced by our available self-regulation as we encounter particular stressors. So the perceived controllability of the situation, along with external factors such as support that we might be getting from our environment, cultural influences, things we expect of ourselves or others expect of us that may be external, or the environment that the stressor is being encountered in, can also impact how we appraise and respond to these stressors. So in other words, stress appraisal is a very, very dynamic process that can change. Even though it's the same stressor, a same person, we can perceive it differently in different situations, and of course, the same stressor among different people can be interpreted differently. We have addressed goal orientation in a previous lesson in more detail. Now we're going to look at how goal orientation and stress appraisal interact with each other, and how we perceive stressors based on the actual goal orientation that we are operating within. So understanding how these factors interact offers us important insights on how we are thinking through a process. It also helps us to understand how emotions are affecting our perceptions of stress. And finally, it actually helps us to understand which behaviors we're going to be deploying or using when we're working on a task. So let's go through these individually. We're going to begin with mastery avoidance. And if we're operating within mastery avoidance orientation, we're going to view stressors as threatening since we're going to feel as though we're maybe being threatened toward being able to accomplish a particular standard or task. And this perspective will likely lead to a hindrance appraisal of stress and will cause us anxiety regarding our potential setbacks or mistakes that we might make. The next orientation is performance avoidance. Here we're going to perceive stressors as threats to our external validation or social standing. So this leads to task avoidance in order to avoid negative judgment from others or loss of self-esteem in regards to us feeling as though we look incompetent at performing a particular task. And this orientation leads to increased stress appraisal, of course, and we're going to fear disapproval from others. Next, we'll look at performance approach. Now, this one is complex because we can have positive or negative feelings from this based on how we feel we are performing or might perform in a particular situation. So here we're using stress as a motivator for goal attentiveness if we feel confident, but if we don't feel confident, then we're going to view our stressors as hindrances, since we may face performance shortfalls that result in a loss of external validation. And then finally, again, the most adaptive of the orientations is mastery approach. And within this orientation, stress is going to be viewed as growth. So if we fail or failure is encountered, then we're not going to blame our lack of ability. Instead, we're going to seek to adjust our strategy and simply increase our skill or learning in order to overcome the particular obstacle that we're facing. We're going to finish today's lesson with a short discussion on how state orientation affects our stress appraisal. A state orientation, or the context or environment in which we are currently pursuing our goal, will also strongly influence our stress appraisal by shaping how we perceive and respond to specific situations within the environment. So our environment can offer support or resources in the form of encouragement or organizational resources. However, our environments can also be interpreted as hindering if our self-esteem is put at risk. If we don't feel comfortable with help seeking, then we're likely going to avoid tasks and struggle with anxiety within that environment. So importantly, research has shown that our goal orientation, remember, our goal orientation then affects our stress appraisal, but our environment is very likely going to cause our goal orientation to default to reflect the state orientation. So if growth within our environment is stressed, then we are likely to choose mastery. But if our environment stresses performance, then we're likely to choose performance approach or performance avoidance goal orientations. So therefore, if we're not aware or mindful or careful about being aware of our state orientation, then our goal orientation and therefore stress appraisal will very likely simply be at the mercy of our environment. So what do these environments look like? Performance environments are going to emphasize performance, of course. They're going to want to avoid risk or taking chances, and they're going to want to avoid any kind of challenges to the status quo. They're going to be driven by fear, or they're going to feel tense. And I'm not saying this is always wrong, but in those situations or in that type of environment, you have to be aware, either for yourself or for those that you're leading, that they're very likely going to default to a performance orientation and quite likely a performance avoidance. And you need to be aware of that, and that we're going to have a lot of anxiety, a lot of tension. So even if something is very important to always get right, your folks that are operating within that environment are going to be stressed about that, and that typically results in avoidance. So even though we may have to get something right, that needs to be addressed so that the proper training and skill development is ensured, so that when someone has to perform, they can, and they're not afraid of performing and have that anxiety or the avoidance of dealing with particular tasks that they're going to eventually have to face. On the other hand, mastery environments emphasize growth and development within the long game, or as it's often put, the infinite game. So this will have a sense of collaboration, a lot of support, a lot of training, a lot of growth, and you're going to have the goal orientation of mastery approach very likely chosen at least over time. And again, that may have to be grown into if you're the leader in dealing with folks. They're probably not going to be aware of these different goal orientations anyway, but if you're operating within a mastery environment, you can help folks adapt into or grow into these mastery orientations. For our 3 takeaways, I hope that you will remember the following. Firstly, stress appraisal is a perception. So we have the power to choose or to observe a stressor and define it as a challenge or a hindrance. And sometimes they are hindrances, but we need to identify them, why they're hindrances. Or sometimes they may feel like a hindrance, something we don't want to accomplish, but if it's important, then we can redefine it as a challenge. Remember that our goal orientation influences our stress appraisal. So now, being mindful of what goal orientation we are operating in is going to help us to more positively operate within stress. And then finally, keep in mind that the environment or state that you're operating in is going to strongly influence your goal orientation. So again, this implies that you do have the ability to observe your environment and mindfully choose your goal orientation regardless of the state orientation. Sometimes it's out of your hands, so it's leader driven and you're at the mercy of your leadership. But you may be able to construct your state orientation or move yourself into an environment that is more conductive to the orientation that you want to operate in. Regardless of your state orientation, you do have the ability to choose your goal orientation. So that awareness should help quite a bit in properly appraising stress and your goal orientations. So for our action item this week, we're simply going to identify the stress that you associate with your SMART goals that you're working on. And I want you to shift any stress that is associated with your SMART goal from, if it is hindering, move it to a challenge orientation or appraisal. So it's important that if we're going to face a stress that is related to our goal, that we find a way to make it a challenging stress and not a hindering stress. I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson, and remember, we are shaping your future one habit at a time. Have a great week.